Okay, welcome. Thank you very much for attending. My name is George Zodro, and I'd like to welcome you to the Baker Institute for Public Policy and to an address which is part of a larger conference that we're holding here, which is addressing the topic of prospects for future economic growth in the United States, which is sponsored by our Institute's Center for Public Finance. Most of the members of the center are seated right over there and taking part in what so far has been an excellent conference. I'm delighted to see that we have such a large crowd here, but I'm not all that surprised given the prominence of our speaker. Martin Feldstein is the George F. Baker Professor of Economics at Harvard and President Emeritus of the National Bureau of Economic Research. He served as President and CEO of the National Bureau from 1977 to 1982, and then again from 1984 to 2008. The NBER is simply, without question, one of the most prominent research organizations in economics, and it flourished under his leadership, producing many highly influential, nonpartisan studies on a huge range of economic issues. Professor Feldstein has long been a formidable presence in economic policy in the United States. From 1982 through 1984, he was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors and served as President Reagan's chief economic advisor. In 2006, President Bush appointed him to be a member of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. And in 2009, our recent guest, President Obama, appointed him to be a member of the President's Economic Recovery Advisory Board. He's been a director of many public corporations and acted as an advisor to a host of governments, businesses, and other institutions. Professor Feldstein is also the recipient of numerous academic honors and awards. He received the very prestigious John Bates Clark Medal of the American Economic Association, a prize which is awarded every 2 years to the economist under the age of 40 who has made the greatest contribution to economics. And then a little bit later, he served as president of the American Economic Association. He also won the Daniel M. Holland Medal, which is the most prestigious prize awarded by the National Tax Association in 2003. He's a fellow of the Econometric Society and a fellow of the National Association of Business Economists, among many other affiliations. As many of you know, I think, Professor Feldstein is also a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal and many other publications. In the academic world, he is the author of more than 300 research articles. And if you look at those, it's simply amazing how many of those articles literally started literatures. I have a personal favorite, which is his paper on the theory of optimal tax reform. There were tons of papers on optimal tax design, which is the idea of starting from a clean sheet of paper and saying what the tax system should look like. But Marty was the first to say, well, but we've got an existing tax system, and so we have to worry about how we change the tax system. We want to think about equity in tax reform. And so that was his paper on the theory of optimal tax reform. It's my personal favorite because I basically took that paper, tweaked it a little bit, and that became my dissertation. And that was good enough to get me out of graduate school. So there are many other seminal papers as well. He has papers on the extent to which capital is internationally mobile, the effects of the social security system on capital accumulation, the effects of inflation on the taxation of capital income, several well-known analyses of the efficiency effects of taxation, and his pioneering use of the effects of taxes on taxable income as a way of measuring the total efficiency costs of the income tax. I'm certain that it's simply no exaggeration to say that he has been one of the most preeminent economists in the field of public finance over the past half century. So we are fortunate indeed to have Professor Martin Feldstein with us today to present his keynote address on maintaining future economic growth. Marty.
Well, I hadn't realized what debt you owed me. But I'm delighted to be here. I was very pleased to participate in the conference earlier today, and I look forward to your questions after I make my remarks. When George and John invited me to speak, they suggested that I summarize some of my recent writings about the American economy. that was a great labor-saving suggestion because it meant I didn't have to do new research. And they made it very easy by listing the subjects that they hoped I would discuss. So following their suggestion, I'm going to start by discussing why the U.S. economy has been growing faster than other industrial countries. Then I'll discuss why the official growth rates understate the true increase in real GDP, and why the usual estimates of the growth of middle-class incomes further understate how well those households have been doing. After that, I'm going to turn to the problems in the U.S. economy in the future, particularly the large fiscal deficits. And then at the end of my remarks, I'll say some things about how we might deal with the increase in future deficits and debt. So, starting with the current situation, the growth of real GDP in the U.S. this year will be over 3%. And that's likely to outpace the growth rates in Germany, in France, in Britain, and Japan. More significant, the cumulative growth over many years puts the real level of GDP per capita in the United States ahead of the levels in other major OECD countries. So last year, real GDP per capita in the United States was $58,000. In contrast, per capita real GDP was only $49,000 in Germany, $41,000 in France, $43,000 in the United Kingdom, and just $37,000 in Italy. So why have we done so much better? Here are 10 major structural features of the U.S. economy that contribute to our superior growth performance. First, the United States has an entrepreneurial culture. Individuals in this country demonstrate a desire to start businesses and to grow them. There's also less penalty in the U.S. for failing and starting again. Second, we have a financial system that supports entrepreneurship. The United States has a more developed system of equity finance than the countries of Europe, including angel investors who are willing to finance startups, and a very active venture capital market that helps finance those firms as they grow. The U.S. also has a large, very decentralized banking system with more than 7,000 small banks that provide loans to startup entrepreneurs. Third, we benefit from our world-class research universities. Universities provide much of the basic research that drives high-tech entrepreneurship. Faculty members and doctoral students often spend time with nearby startups, and the culture of the universities and the businesses encourages that activity. Top research universities attract the best students from around the world, many of whom end up staying in the United States. Fourth, the efficiency of our labor markets. U.S. labor markets link workers and jobs unimpeded by labor unions, state-owned industries, and excessively restrictive labor regulations. Less than 7% of the private sector U.S. labor force is unionized. There are virtually no state-owned enterprises. And while the U.S. does regulate working conditions and hiring, the rules are much less onerous than in Europe. As a result, workers in this country have a better chance of finding the right job, firms find it easier to innovate, and new firms find it easier to get started and to grow. Fifth, the U.S. population is growing, including the contribution from immigration. And our population is geographically mobile within the United States. America's growing population means a younger and therefore more trainable and flexible workforce. Although there are restrictions on immigration to the United States, there are also special rules that provide access to the U.S. economy and a path to citizenship based on individual talent and industrial sponsorship. A separate green card lottery provides a way for eager people to come to the United States. Our country's ability to attract qualified immigrants has been an important reason for our prosperity. Sixth, we have a culture and a tax system that encourages hard work and long hours. The average U.S. employee works 1,800 hours per year, substantially more than the 1,500 hours worked in France and the 1,400 hours worked in Germany, although we're not up to the level of 2,200 hours in Hong Kong, Singapore, and South Korea. In general, working longer hours means producing more and therefore means higher real incomes. Seventh, we now have a supply of energy that makes North America energy independent. Natural gas fracking, in particular, has provided U.S. businesses with plentiful and relatively inexpensive energy. Eighth, we have a favorable regulatory environment. Although our regulations are far from perfect, they are much less burdensome on businesses than the regulations imposed by European countries and the European Union. Ninth, we have a smaller government than in other industrial countries. According to the OECD, outlays of the U.S. government at the federal, state, and local levels total 38% of GDP, while in Germany the corresponding figure was 44%, in Italy 51%, and in France a remarkable 57%. The higher level of government spending in other countries implies not only a higher share of income taken in taxes, but also higher transfer payments that reduce incentives to work. And finally, 10th, we have a decentralized political system in which states and local governments compete. Competition among states and communities encourages entrepreneurship and work. States also compete for businesses and for individual residents with their legal rules and tax regimes. Some states have no income taxes and have labor laws that limit unionization. The United States is perhaps unique among major high-income countries in this degree of political decentralization. So that list is why I think the U.S. has grown faster and achieved higher income than other industrial countries. But in fact, the reality is even better than these official statistics. The official data report that the GDP grew at a rate of 2.3% a year over the past 20 years, implying that per capita real GDP grew at just 1.4% a year during those 20 years. I believe that the official data substantially understate real growth of output and incomes. This is important not just to economists. I think it reduces the public's faith in our economic and political system. It creates pessimism, and it contributes to populist political attitudes and to the opposition to international trade. So here's why the government's method causes an underestimation of real economic growth. What does the government do? It surveys a large number of firms and collects data on the market value of their sales of goods and services. The total of these sales is nominal GDP. It must then convert the year-to-year changes in nominal GDP into a change in the price level and a change in real output. That is, the real value to consumers and to final users. In doing so, it faces two very difficult problems: reflecting the changing quality of existing products and services, and measuring the value created by new products and services. Consider first how the government statisticians deal with quality change. Their method, I will explain, tells us the increase in inputs rather than what we care about, the value of output. The government's most common method for dealing with quality change is what the government calls the resource cost method. That name tells you everything. It tells you that their way of measuring is about the cost of production rather than the value to consumers and other end users. More specifically, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, follows more than 5,000 product categories. For each, they ask the manufacturer, has the product changed since the time of the last survey? If the answer is no, then any change in the price of the product is correctly regarded as inflation, and there is no quality change. But if the manufacturer says the current model is different from the previous one, the BLS asks about, and I quote, the extra cost of the new input requirements that are directly tied to the change in product quality. The extra cost, not about the value of the output. If and only if there is a reported increase in the cost of making the product, does the BLS conclude that there is a quality improvement. This is a very strange definition. This is a narrow and incorrect way to measure quality improvement. In reality, of course, producers improve products in ways that don't cost more and may cost less. That's what we call technical progress. But the government's recourse cost method focuses on the cost of inputs rather than on the true value of output. That's why the government, let's see if I can open this bottle, and success number one. That's why the government doesn't measure the output change, but just the volume of inputs. I've described this for products, for manufacturing, but the same approach is generally applied to services. For example, this is true for healthcare, where we have seen enormous improvements over the years, but where the official statistics imply that productivity in the health sector has actually been declining. Nonsense. Let me be clear. I do recognize that the problem of measuring quality change is a very difficult challenge for the government statisticians. So I'm not being critical of the efforts of the government statisticians. My point is that these estimates are mislabeled and misinterpreted. When it comes to the quality change of existing products, what is called quality change is really just the growth of real inputs. The result is probably a major underestimate of the growth of real GDP that comes from quality improvements. The other major source of the underestimation of real GDP growth is the government's failure to capture the benefits of new goods and services. Here's how the government procedure works. A new product or service is developed and sold to the public. Its market sales then enter nominal GDP. The nominal value of GDP is converted to real GDP using price indexes that don't reflect the new product at all. So the process, therefore, never tries to take into account the value created by the new product per se. Let me give you an example. The introduction of statins, the pharmaceutical product that lowers cholesterol and reduces deaths from heart attacks and strokes. Within a few years after it was introduced, statin drugs were the best-selling pharmaceutical products in history. When patents on statins expired and the prices of those products fell, the BLS concluded that since statins could be bought at a lower price, real incomes had increased. Yes, but this says nothing about the improvements to health and longevity, the reduced costs to hospitals that resulted from the introduction of statins. The major contribution that statins made to public health was never reflected in real output and real incomes. Between 2000 and 2007, the percentage of men over age 65 taking a statin doubled to 50%. High cholesterol levels fell to half what they had been, and death rates from heart disease among those over age 65 fell by 1/3. So there was a remarkable contribution of this product to the public's well-being, but none of it was reflected in real GDP. So, to summarize this discussion of mismeasuring the growth of real GDP, the official methods simply do not capture the contribution of new products, and they understate the contribution of improvements in quality, because they measure the increase in inputs rather than the value of outputs. Let me turn now from the measurement of GDP as a whole, the country as a whole, to the problem of measuring personal incomes. The official census data report that median real household incomes rose by less than 10% between 1984 and 2013. That is less than 10% cumulatively over those 20 years. So that translates to an annual rate of less than 0.4% a year. A special study by the Congressional Budget Office looked at the middle quintile of households in the 32 years from 1979 to 2011 and confirmed that the real cash earnings of those households rose by the same annual rate as median household incomes. But these middle-class households receive near cash benefits from employers and the government, including health insurance and food stamps, and they're not counted in the numbers I've just quoted. Also, the federal tax share paid by these middle-class households fell during those years from 19% of total taxes to just 11%. When those omissions are taken into account, the real incomes of these middle quintile households was calculated by the Congressional Budget Office to have increased by 45% over those same 32 years. And of course, that's based on the overpriced GDP price index that is implicit in the calculation of real GDP. So the true increase was even greater. So, in short, the past was very good, better than the official statistics say, both for the economy as a whole and for middle-class families. Unfortunately, the future will see a lower rate of growth. In the next few years, the economy may slip into a recession after nearly a decade of strong growth. But looking past that potential recession, the rest of the decade and beyond, we are likely to see lower growth because of the rapid rise in the fiscal deficit and the national debt. Before the economic downturn that began in 2007, the federal debt was generally less than 40% of GDP. By 2017, the debt as a share of GDP had nearly doubled to 75%. And looking ahead to the year 2028, 10 years from now, the Congressional Budget Office projects that the debt will be 96% of GDP. The annual fiscal deficits are also projected to increase. The deficit was 3.5% of GDP last year and is projected by the Congressional Budget Office to rise to 5.1% in 2028. So the debt and the deficit are both rising rapidly. These officially projected deficit and debt levels are based on the Congressional Budget Office convention, which is required by law, of making forecasts based on current law, current tax law, and current spending law. The CBO does not try to use its judgment to guess what will happen unless it's in the current law. For example, the 2017 tax legislation reduced personal tax rates substantially, but these reductions are scheduled to expire in 2025. If Congress votes to maintain the lower tax rates after 2025, the deficits will be substantially higher. Congress also recently voted to increase defense spending slightly to 3.1% of GDP this year, and to raise the level of non-defense discretionary spending to 3.3% of GDP this year. But current law specifies, and therefore the CBO has to reflect, that defense spending will decline to 2.6% of GDP in 2028, and non-defense discretionary spending will also decrease to 2.8% of GDP that year. The history of defense outlays in the past and the challenges faced by the United States and our military around the world suggest that defense spending will actually rise much more rapidly than current law implies. For example, defense outlays in 1970 were 8.1% of GDP, and even in 1980 were 4.4% of GDP. So heading down to 2.6%, as the law provides, I think, understates where we're going. If Congress votes to raise defense outlays, Democrats are likely to insist on an equal increase in non-defense discretionary outlays. An increase in defense and non-defense discretionary spending and a continuation of the current rates after 2025 for taxes will cause the deficit in 2028 to rise substantially from the currently projected 5.1%. In the long run, the debt to GDP ratio is equal. I get emotional about this thought. In the long run, the debt to GDP ratio is equal to the ratio of the annual deficit to the nominal GDP growth rate. So if the future deficit rises for not to just 5.1%, but to 7%, and the growth rate of nominal GDP is 4%, the implied debt to GDP ratio would be 7, the deficit, divided by 4, the growth rate, or 175%. Of course, if that were to be the projected future debt ratio, the interest rate on our federal debt would rise, causing the deficit and the debt to be even higher. Even without these future changes in tax rules and budget outlays, the debt to GDP ratio will undoubtedly exceed 100%. Combining the CBO's estimate of 2028 with a deficit of 5.1% with a plausible nominal GDP growth rate of 4% would imply a debt ratio of 125% of GDP. And that would be enough to push up interest rates, raising both the deficit and the debt. A larger annual budget deficit and increasing debt ratio can slow the growth of real GDP through several channels. The key mechanism is to reduce investment in plant and equipment and in research and development. The most direct impact is by absorbing funds that would otherwise be invested in plant and equipment or used by firms to finance research and development. Since the combination of household savings and retained corporate earnings is only about 8% of GDP, a fiscal deficit that is heading to 5% of GDP or higher will absorb more than half of the national saving. After offsetting the funds needed for investment in residential construction, there's little left for business investment. Business investment is also discouraged by higher real interest rates. Large-scale government borrowing to finance the budget deficit causes real interest rates to rise, and the higher interest rates then discourages borrowing by businesses to finance business investment. Even when the annual deficit is not large, the cumulative effect of past deficits produces a large national debt. Households and other portfolio investors require higher interest rates to hold that larger quantity of government debt. And those higher interest rates raise the cost of capital to firms and reduce business investment. Higher interest rates also depress equity prices and thereby raise the cost of equity capital. So business investments respond to the higher cost of equity capital by reducing business investment. Moreover, increases in budget deficits and debt cause business decision makers to fear that taxes will have to be raised in future years to service the future debt or to reduce those deficits. This expectation of higher future taxes also discourages current investment. So, the adverse effect of large deficits on economic growth makes it important to understand the source of these larger deficits. The annual deficit is projected by the Congressional Budget Office to rise from 4% of GDP this year to 5.1% of 2028. And as I said, reality would push it higher than that. But let's focus on this move from 4% to 5.1%. Why will it happen? Much attention has been focused on the tax legislation enacted at the end of last year. The legislation was designed subject to a mandatory limit on the resulting debt increase over 10 years of $1.5 trillion. The corporate tax changes in that last year's bill added $500 billion to the 10-year debt forecast, and the changes in the personal income tax added another $1 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the tax legislation raised the national debt in 2028 from 91%, where it would otherwise be, to 96% of GDP. So it only projected an increase of 5 percentage points from 91 to 96. More generally, the Congressional Budget Office forecasts that the annual tax revenue will rise over the next 10 years from 16.6% of GDP to 18.5%. So the annual revenue as a percent of GDP is forecast to rise by 1.9% of GDP over the decade, despite the permanent corporate tax cut. What else is driving the deficits and debt during the coming 10 years? As I've already said, the discretionary spending on defense and non-defense program is not the reason. Defense outlays as a percentage of GDP are projected to decline from 3.1% this year to 2.6% 10 years from now. Similarly, non-defense discretionary spending is also projected to decline from 3.3% this year to 2.8% a decade from now. Thus, each is projected to decline by 0.5% of GDP, so that total discretionary spending will actually fall, according to the CBO's estimates, by 1% of GDP. Interest payments on the national debt are projected to rise by 1% of GDP, from 1.4% this year to 2.4% a decade from now. That reflects the combination of the larger national debt and the higher interest rate that the government will have to pay on that debt. So the extra 1% of GDP that the government will pay in interest on the national debt just balances the reduced outlays on discretionary spending. So, all of the net increase in the 2028 deficit comes from increased outlays on Social Security and the major health programs, Medicare and Medicaid. The Congressional Budget Office projects that outlays for Social Security will rise from 4.9% of GDP this year to 6% in 2028, a rise of 1.1%. And during the same years, the outlays for Medicare and Medicaid rise from 5.4% of GDP to 7.3%. The higher cost of Social Security reflects the aging of the population and the higher percentage of the population that chooses to retire at different ages. The higher cost of the Medicare and Medicaid programs also reflects the aging of the population and the decisions of older Americans to choose to be covered by those programs. But the rising cost of health programs also reflects the changing health of the older population and the increasing cost of medical care. Looking further ahead, the healthcare programs are the major source of rising outlays. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that with no change in health program rules, the outlays for the health programs in the 20 years after 2028 will rise from 6.8% of GDP to 9.2%. In those same years, Social Security outlays will increase only a tiny amount, from 6% to 6.3%. So it's clear to me that the growth of the deficit requires changing the rules of Social Security and of the health care programs. Now, dealing with the health programs involves a much more complicated set of changes than slowing the growth of Social Security. So I'm going to focus in a moment on how to slow the growth of Social Security. But before doing so, let me say something about how revenue might be raised without the adverse effects on growth that would result from higher tax rates on individuals and businesses. Raising tax rates on households and businesses would reduce budget deficits, but would directly hurt economic growth. It's possible, however, to raise revenue without the adverse effects of increasing tax rates. There are two ways to achieve this: limiting tax expenditures and taxing the sources of carbon emissions. Tax expenditures are the features of the tax code that substitute for direct government spending. For example, because the government wants to encourage home ownership, it allows individuals to deduct mortgage interest payments when calculating taxable income. Similarly, to encourage the purchase of health insurance, the tax rules exclude employer payments for health insurance from taxable income. The revenue loss from tax expenditures, from deductions, exclusions, and credits in 2014 was $1.6 trillion, more than 8% of GDP. Limiting tax expenditures would not only raise revenue, but would reduce the adverse effects that result from distorting expenditure decisions. Limiting deductions would also simplify tax filing by causing taxpayers to shift from itemizing deductions to using the standard deduction. The tax legislation last year took a step in that direction by limiting the deductibility of state and local taxes. This change is expected to raise an estimated $100 billion a year and induce a very large number of individuals to shift from itemizing to using the standard deduction. So limiting tax expenditures is, I think, a good idea. Now, while taxing output and income discourages activities and hurts economic growth, taxing bad activities is desirable because it discourages those activities. And the leading candidate for this approach is to tax carbon emissions that create climate change problems. The most practical and efficient way to do that is to tax the production of coal, oil, and gas. The producers would pass these taxes on in the form of higher prices. The users of those products, businesses and households, would respond to the higher prices by reducing the use of those products. For example, a higher tax on oil would lead to a higher price of gasoline, causing users to drive less and to prefer smaller cars. The separate tax rate on oil, gas, and coal could be set so that each of them had the same effect on the production of carbon dioxide. Let me turn finally to the idea of slowing the growth of Social Security. Slowing the growth of Social Security will contribute to faster real GDP growth in two ways. First, it will increase national saving by reducing future budget deficits. Second, lower Social Security benefits will encourage working-age individuals to increase their own saving for retirement. The politically simplest way to slow the growth of Social Security benefits would be to repeat the kind of change that was enacted in 1983. At that time, the White House and the Congress agreed on a bipartisan basis to raise the age for full benefits from 65 to 67. To protect those individuals who were near to retirement age, the legislation provided for a delay before the increase would begin, and more important, for a very gradual rate of increase. After the initial delay, the age for full benefits was scheduled to rise at a rate of just 1 month per year. So the 2-year rise in the age for full benefits took more than 25 years. The great advantage of this combination of delay and a gradual rise is that when it was enacted on a bipartisan basis, it never experienced any political opposition. Although later polls showed that the public opposed plans to raise the age for full benefits, they didn't realize that that was gradually happening. No member of Congress ever introduced legislation to repeal the original delay in the age for full benefits. When fully phased in, the 2-year delay in benefit availability had a substantial effect on the cost of the Social Security program. An individual at age 65 in 1983 had a life expectancy of 18 years. Since benefits are now actuarially adjusted to age 67, regardless of the individual's actual age of retirement, raising the age for full benefits by 2 years reduced the expected number of years of benefits from 18 to 16, a reduction of 11%. And that translates into a reduction in the cost of Social Security of more than 0.5% of GDP. Raising the retirement age from 65 to 67 also, I think, had a positive effect on private savings. Individuals would have an incentive, do have an incentive, to increase their lifetime savings to maintain their consumption in retirement. Now, since the year 1983, when that legislation to delay the age for full benefits was enacted, life expectancy for individuals at age 67 has already increased by an additional 3 years. So it seems reasonable to me to raise the full benefit retirement age by another 3 years from 67 to 70. Although there are large savings in the Social Security program from these kinds of delays, they don't fix the important problem in the Social Security program that must be fixed. The rules that govern the Social Security program provide that the Social Security payroll taxes are all deposited into what is called the Social Security Trust Fund. Now, the trust fund is not a true investment fund that invests in stocks and bonds. It's essentially an accounting system that keeps track of the funds deposited and the benefits paid out. The key fact about the trust fund is that all Social Security benefits must be paid out of the trust fund. The aggregate annual benefits now exceed the aggregate payroll taxes. So as a result, the trust fund is shrinking. The Social Security actuaries now estimate that the trust fund will be exhausted in 2034, just 16 years from now. Slowing the growth of benefits by raising the retirement age will delay the time of exhaustion, but they won't prevent the trust fund from reaching zero. So it's not clear what will happen then, since under current law, benefits can only be paid when there is a positive balance in the trust fund. Social Security payroll taxes, of course, will continue to be collected in the future, and the 12.4% payroll tax revenue that is deposited in that year in the trust fund would be enough to pay about 2/3 of the benefits that are projected. It would be possible, but unlikely, to cut the benefits by 1/3 so they can be financed by the available revenue. An alternative option would be to raise the payroll tax rate. If the age of full retirement is not adjusted, it would take an increase in the payroll tax from 12% to 19% to meet the costs of the benefits projected under current law. A further option would be to supplement the funds going into the trust fund with transfers from general revenue, from the personal income tax and the corporate tax. Since total tax collections are less than 20% of GDP and personal income taxes are less than 10% of GDP, the increase in those taxes to maintain benefits would be equal to 50% of personal taxes or 25% of total taxes. I've also proposed an alternative approach in research with a colleague, Andrew Samwick. And the basic idea of that is to have a mixed system that continues the current pay-as-you-go system with a 12% payroll tax, but supplements the pay-as-you-go benefits with investment-based annuities. And in our research, we showed that it would be possible to pay the pay-as-you-go benefits, gradually reducing them while the investment-based benefits would grow. And finally, the combination would be as large or larger than the benefits that are currently projected. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to your comments or questions on anything I've said. Thank you very much. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. One about your past and one about the future. One, in the past, could you comment a little bit on your reflections on the legacy of your time with the Reagan administration and the kind of the decisive, what was the decisive point we were at for our nation at that time, and the role that maybe the economic policies played at that time? That's one question. And in the future, you commented on the factors affecting our economy, immigration policy, and how it's significant to the role of immigration policy and the integration of immigrants is essential to one component of our strength, and how you think that may be being impacted in the future.
Well, let me first say that serving President Reagan for 2 years in the White House was a great honor for me and a great treat. He was a wonderful man to work for. And during those years, we did the Social Security reform. We brought down taxes. So there were major changes that helped the economic growth. And at the same time, Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve tightened monetary policy, bringing down very sharply the inflation rate, which was double-digit, so that interest rates fell, and we contributed in that way to the growth of real income in the 1980s. So it was a very good time, and a very good contribution by both President Reagan and Chairman Volcker. Looking ahead, immigration. I look at what happens in Canada. And Canada has, I think, a much better system of immigration. It looks for people who will contribute to the Canadian economy rather than simply bringing in the relatives of existing immigrants. And I hope that we will move in that direction in the coming years, because if we do that, immigration will make a much more positive contribution, and judging by the attitude of the Canadians to the immigrant population there, it will be much less controversial because they'll be seen as adding positively to the growth and performance of the economy. Yes, sir.
You didn't touch on income inequality, but it's something over the last few years there's been a lot of discussion about and concern about rising income inequality.
So, yes, so I don't know if you can hear the question in the back. He asked, what about income inequality? There's been concern about that. A lot of that concern is based on bad data, misinterpretation of data. As I indicated, think about the middle class. The middle class take the official statistics, hardly had any increase at all over 20 years. Instead, you adjust for the cash income by adding to it the near cash benefits, food stamps, Social Security benefits, and the reduction in the taxes paid by the middle class, middle quintile, and the number was much, much bigger. And I think if you look at the very bottom, not the very, very bottom, the very, very bottom, the real poor, that's a serious problem, and we should be concerned about that. But if you look more generally at the lower incomes, again, the fact that we measure output growth incorrectly, that we underestimate the growth, means that we're overstating the inflation. So that the cash income of, say, the bottom quintile the real value of it is understated. So I wish we could get the journalists and the politicians who talk about these things to understand the extent to which the numbers are not an accurate reflection of what's actually going on.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Follow up on this inequality of income. You started your talk by talking about the average income in America, and I think we've learned the average income is a very poor measure of how many people in our society is doing. You didn't even touch upon the fact that the fraction of income going to capital has risen dramatically in the last few years. The fraction of income going to labor has fallen. And it touches upon that last point you talked about. You didn't even talk about one solution to the Social Security problem, which is to raise the cap on income that's taxed. That I've read that when they did the reform, as you talked about in '83, they projected the rise of age, et cetera. They did not project, they thought that they were capturing 80% of the income with the cap, but they didn't actually anticipate the skewing of income, and so that now the cap does not capture as much income for tax that it was. So why not include increasing the tax, the cap of income that's taxed to solve the Social Security problem?
Well, it wouldn't solve the problem, but it would help. So let me comment on that specific suggestion, which has been made by many people. Right now, as you say, we tax about 80% of the income is below the current cap, which I think is around $135,000. So if we raised it from $135,000 to say $160,000, we would capture more of the payroll tax, more of the payroll income for the payroll tax. So there would be some adverse effect on labor supply and on earnings. People would find ways to change their compensation, especially people in those income brackets, to change their compensation from taxable cash to other forms of compensation, more untaxed fringe benefits. But there's no doubt that the Social Security Trust Fund and Social Security would get more revenue. But that same shrinking of the earnings would also affect the personal income tax. And I've done a careful study that looks at those, and so if we took the number from $135,000 to, say, $160,000, the Social Security Trust Fund would get more revenue, but the personal income tax would get less revenue, and so net-net, there wouldn't be any significant increase in revenue. So if you want to have a significant increase in revenue, you'd have to push that up way beyond the $160,000. Yes, sir.
What about using something like a 401k plan or the government employees retirement fund to help solve the Social Security problem as was proposed several years ago?
So what about using something like the 401k? I'm just repeating your question. The 401k kind of plan. So what I said toward the end, the work that I had done with my colleague Andrew Samwick, was along those lines. We said, let's keep the payroll tax, 12.4%. That's not going to be enough to finance the retirement benefits that are scheduled in current law. But if we add to that personal retirement accounts, just what you're talking about, then we can have a combination that works. So people would be secure that the pay-as-you-go system would give them a risk-free retirement income source, but then they can get a more efficient way of accumulating retirement by using personal retirement accounts. I hope we do that, but I'm not counting on it. Yes, sir.
You listed 10 factors at the start about that, that distinguish the U.S. in terms of prospects for growth. Which of those factors do you think are the one or two or three, top three, you would say, are under the greatest threat, greatest risk?
Under the greatest threat. So the question of my 10 positive factors for U.S. growth, which ones are under the greatest threat? Maybe I have to go back and look at the list, but I don't see those as under threat. I mean, the tax system that is favorable to higher effort, the decentralized political system, the strong equity finance, all of those things I think are solidly there. Yes, sir.
Supposedly in 2016, that the average amount of money that people had when they retired was like $347,000, but the mean and the mode on that was like $5,014.
I can believe all that.
So it looks like half the people don't have $5,000. And
No, but what they have is Social Security. And so Social Security for a man with his wife replaces about 60%, and that's been true for a long time, about 60% of their pre-retirement income. Kids are grown up. If they own a home, the mortgage is paid off. They've got their consumer durables. So 60% covers most of what they need to continue to have a pretty comfortable retirement life. Some people may fall through the trap for one reason or another and not have that. But if you ask, where is the average person? They don't have much cash. Why don't they have much cash? Because they don't need it. Because they've discovered over the years that Uncle Joe, when he retired, he didn't have much cash, but he had Social Security, and it did a good job for him. Yes, sir.
I kind of have two questions. One of them is a follow-up to the way. So you answered the the wealth inequality issue by saying that like a false measurement of inflation kind of understated the lower quintiles growth. So wouldn't that also apply to the growth of the higher incomes as well, and so that the proportion would be correct? And then also, how would you reconcile the the large growth of the middle class incomes, as you mentioned, with their perception that they haven't been growing in the way that they've...
Let me start with that. They read the newspaper, and the newspaper tells them that the official statistics said they haven't grown at all. And I don't know how to fight that. I do my best. I talk about it. I write about it. But the economic report of the president 2 years ago, in the last year of the Obama administration, had those same numbers, no growth for middle-class incomes, even though the Congressional Budget Office had explained, as I said, that the growth was much higher than that. But everybody feels that somehow I'm not doing as well as I should be, and somebody else is doing better. But I think the reality is we've all done, including the middle class and those below it, much better. Now, you referred to what I said about wealth, but in fact I was talking about income, not wealth. But I think the wealth issue is an important one, and it comes back to the same issue that was raised over here. Most people, when they reach retirement age, don't have much wealth. But if we count the wealth in Social Security, it gives you a very different picture, because that's the wealth. What is wealth? Wealth is the ability to go on spending when you don't have income. And that's what Social Security does. And it's also what unemployment benefits do. So we leave those out when we look at the distribution of wealth, and we say, gosh, only the top part of the income distribution has a lot of wealth. But in fact, if you include Social Security wealth, unemployment insurance wealth, there's a lot more wealth there for the middle class. Yes, sir.
You suggested to increase the government incomes by avoiding the deduction on mortgage on houses that is excluded from the income for tax purposes.
I said that could be done.
But that will cause a lot of people not to buy houses. Because houses is for a lot of people a saving for old age when they can sell their house and have an income. The second thing is, then they will need, if they would not have houses, they will need more Medicaid. The other thing is that the income of the states on property taxes will go down. So you will increase the federal government income, but you will decrease the state income.
So somehow I think that if I don't live in my owned house, I live in an apartment, the local government will have that to tax instead. So I don't think that there will be such a shrinking of the tax base. And I think if we were to, we now have a limit on the tax deductibility of mortgage interest. You can deduct mortgage interest on up to 2 homes, up to $1 million of mortgage principal. That didn't collapse home ownership or the mortgage market, even among high-income individuals. I think if we decide to gradually reduce the deductibility of mortgage interest, it should be done gradually, and it should be done over time, so that somebody who recently bought a house doesn't find that they've wiped out his equity by virtue of taxing or eliminating the deductibility of mortgage interest. But I think as we move away from tax expenditures, I think that's a natural place to go.
I think we have time for one more question.
George, I'll let you pick it.
Okay, let's go there. Sorry.
So it's a two-part, like everybody's how do you feel about...
That wasn't part of the deal.
That's okay.
How do you feel that because corporate debt is at an all-time high, how do you think in long-term corporate debt is at an all-time high on top of it? How do you think that's going to affect GDP and real GDP in the long term? Do you think the tax changes, I could throw out section code, it's not going to matter, but trying to repatriate some of those funds, do you think that's going to have a positive effect? Right now, a lot of corps are just buying back their own stock rather than paying down debt. So I think, I want to know...
Well, debt is very cheap. Debt is very cheap.
We
The
have
Fed
to
is...
refinance, though. At some
Second? Yeah, that's right. So why are they doing it? They're doing it because the Fed has kept interest rates very low for a decade. So long-term bonds as well as short-term debt are very cheap. And so that's what they're doing. Are they taking a risk? They sure are. Any other question?
The other thing is the deal, they just came out with a report of the DOD got audited, the Department of Defense got audited, and they came back with a 90% failure rate on their control measures. We talk about a reduction in spending at the, for the DOD. Do you think that that's going to...
So I don't know that study, so I can't really say. But anyway, I've enjoyed the questions, and I enjoyed having a chance to talk to all of you.